Welcome to Voices from Forgotten Souls. Before we begin, tell us in the comment section where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time of the day. If you have not subscribed yet, kindly do so now, and remember to like this video, because what you are about to hear is a story you will not want to miss a single paragraph of. Relax your mind, stay away from all distractions, and pay close attention as we begin the forgotten and chilling story of Louis Congo, the enslaved man who became an executioner, gained rare power, and used it to take revenge in ways history tried to cover. In the humid colony of Louisiana, during the early years of the 18th century, long before the world imagined a place called America as we know it, there lived an enslaved African man named Louis Congo. Few people today know his name, yet in those early French settlements, his presence carried fear, confusion, and a strange kind of dark respect. Louis was born far away across the Atlantic, but brought to Louisiana as property, and thrown into a world where survival depended on silence, obedience, and the ability to suffer without breaking. The colony was still young, filled with harsh laws, greedy traders, desperate settlers and officers who believed that cruelty was the only language an enslaved person could understand. It was within this cruel world that the tale of Louis Congo took shape. History remembers him because he became the official executioner of the colony, a role no enslaved person had ever received. But the true story, the story hidden between the lines, is how he used that unusual position to take revenge against the very people who once tortured him. His life was a shadowy mixture of obedience and rebellion, loyalty and secret planning, and every moment he lived carried a spark of danger. Louis did not choose the role of executioner. In those times, executions were carried out by criminals, debtors, or anyone the government saw fit to force into the job. No free man wanted the responsibility because it brought shame, fear, and social isolation. The French officials decided that offering this position to an enslaved man might save them trouble. They believed that an enslaved person was already forced to live in shame, so giving him the role of executioner could not make his life worse. But in truth, they failed to understand the mind of Louis Congo. They did not know he carried scars in his memory that burned like open wounds. They did not know he had once been beaten almost to death by slave catchers when he attempted to escape. They did not know the pain he carried for friends who had died from whips and chains. They did not know that within his calm and silent face lived a deep, determined fire of vengeance. When the government offered Louis the role of executioner, they promised him something no enslaved person had ever received in Louisiana. They promised him freedom. It sounded like a miracle. Many enslaved people saw freedom as a star in the sky, distant and unreachable. Louis understood that accepting this role meant stepping into darkness, but he also understood it might give him power. And power was something he never had before. What the officials did not realize was that Louis had a sharp mind. He understood people. He understood silence. He understood fear. He knew that the role would place him near criminals, slave hunters, overseers, and even plantation owners who broke the law. He knew the position would allow him to watch and listen. It would give him access to whispers and secrets. Most importantly, it would give him a chance to study the people who once hurt him, the very men who thought he was too broken to fight back. Louis accepted the position. The officials celebrated, believing they had solved a problem. But deep inside the thoughts of Louis Congo, something was shifting. He was no longer a man waiting for punishment. He was a man, waiting for the right opportunity. People whispered that he walked differently after he became the executioner, not with pride, but with quiet purpose, as if he carried a secret no one else could understand. Many enslaved people watched him and wondered whether he had betrayed them by accepting a position that required him to carry out the cruelest sentences. Others believed he was a symbol of hope because he had done the impossible, but none of them knew that Louis Congo was walking toward a silent revenge, a revenge born from pain, patience, and the understanding that the world never gives power freely. It must be taken quietly, step by step, until the day comes when the oppressed can finally strike back. The role of executioner came with responsibilities. Louis Congo was required to perform public punishments, lashings, and in some cases, death sentences. These punishments were held in open squares, where settlers stood and watched as if it were a performance. People feared him, not because he enjoyed the work, but because he carried it out with a chilling calmness. His face never changed. His eyes never showed anger or mercy. But that calmness hid something else. Every time he lifted the whip, every time he raised the axe, every time he placed someone in the stocks, he remembered the men who once beat him. He remembered their laughter. He remembered the sting of the whip cutting through his skin. He remembered their voices, telling him he was nothing. And as he remembered, he planned. He watched the overseers. He studied the guards. He learned their habits, their weaknesses, their arrogance. No one suspected that the quiet executioner was preparing for something far more deadly than the job he had been given. To gain trust, Louis needed to show loyalty. He understood that. He carried out his duties with precision. He followed orders exactly, never questioning, never hesitating. The officials began to trust him. They saw him as useful, as obedient, as someone who accepted his place. They gave him more freedom to move around. They allowed him access to places no enslaved person ever stepped into. Louis walked through council halls, storage rooms, government offices, and military yards. He learned where weapons were stored. He learned who controlled the flow of information. He learned which officers were feared and which were growing bold in their cruelty. But one detail mattered more than anything else. He learned the location of the very slave hunters and overseers who had tortured him years earlier. These men had no idea that the man they once beat until he nearly died now held a position designed to break others. They did not know that he remembered every blow, every insult. They did not know that Louis Congo was living every day with a quiet hunger for justice. At night, Louis slept lightly, always listening. The colony was a place of noise, violence, and fear. Sometimes he heard the distant cries of enslaved people being punished in the darkness. Sometimes he heard drunken overseers bragging about their cruelty. Sometimes he overheard officials talking about rebellions, punishments, and rumors of runaway groups seeking revenge. All these sounds shaped his thoughts. He understood that he could not simply attack his enemies in the open. He needed a plan that protected him from suspicion. So he waited and watched for mistakes. Over time, he began to see them. An overseer would drink too much. A slave hunter would walk alone in the forest. A guard would slip away from his post to visit a tavern. Each mistake became a possibility. Each possibility became a path. And Louis wanted to choose the path that would strike fear into the hearts of every cruel master in Louisiana. Louis believed in timing. He believed that revenge taken too early would be wasted, and that revenge taken too late might never come. So he prepared slowly, carefully, and quietly. He sharpened his skills. He grew stronger. He became more confident. And he waited for the moment that would open the door to his first act of justice. That moment would come from a man he once feared more than any other. That man was the leader of the slave catchers, a man known for tracking runaways across swamps and forests with cruel satisfaction. Years earlier, he had beaten Louis so badly that many believed he would die. Now fate was preparing to bring them face to face once again. And Louis Congo, the executioner who lived behind a calm mask, was ready. The humid air of Louisiana seemed heavier on the morning. Louis Congo first saw the slave catcher who once nearly killed him. Years had passed, but the memory of that beating still lived inside him, like a fire that refused to die. The man arrived at the punishment square with 2 captured runaways tied behind him. His voice was loud, filled with pride, as he bragged to the officials about how he tracked them through mud, marsh, and sharp bushes that tore their feet. Louis watched silently from the corner as the officials assigned the task of punishment to him. The slave catcher did not even recognize Louis. To the catcher, enslaved faces blurred together like shadows, with no identity. Louis walked forward with controlled steps, hiding the storm rising inside him. He accepted the order with calm obedience, but inside his mind, something was awakening. He had waited for this moment, and now it stood in front of him wearing the same arrogant smile he remembered from years earlier. The slave catcher stood close as Louis prepared the punishment. Louis kept his eyes lowered so the man would not study his face too carefully. The catcher continued talking, bragging about the pain he caused, laughing cruelly about how he used his boots to grind the faces of runaways who dared resist. His laughter echoed in Louis's ears like the memory of thunder. The smell of sweat, horses, and humid earth surrounded them as Louis lifted the whip. But the whip was not his focus. Instead, he watched the angles, the distance, the movement of guards nearby, and the way people gathered. He noted every detail with the mind of a man building a quiet trap. As he carried out the official punishment on the runaways, he made sure no one suspected that his real target was standing only a few feet away. The catcher never imagined that the executioner handling the whip was the same man he once dragged through a forest while beating him with a rifle. After the punishment ended, Louis stepped away to clean the tools. The officials went inside to discuss routine matters. The catcher remained outside, leaning against a wooden post as he drank from a metal cup. Louis noticed that the guards were distracted. Some argued about directions, others argued about supplies, and a few simply wandered off. The moment of opportunity appeared like a whisper. It was not yet time to strike, but it was time to begin shaping the path. Louis approached the catcher slowly, still pretending to be the obedient executioner. The catcher looked at him with lazy arrogance. He made a small joke about how Louis was too calm for a man who dealt with blood. Louis responded with quiet respect, keeping his voice soft so he would seem harmless. But his eyes briefly rose, just long enough to meet the catcher's gaze. In that moment, the catcher paused, sensing something familiar. Louis lowered his gaze immediately, letting the doubt pass. The hunter shook his head and dismissed the thought. He turned away. Louis knew he had succeeded. The man had looked but had not recognized him. That meant Louis had time. When the sun finally fell behind the trees and the plantation shadows stretched across the ground, Louis walked home, thinking about what he must do next. The world around him appeared peaceful,
But inside him, the tension was tightening, like a rope pulled from both ends. He understood that revenge was not a single act. It was a series of quiet steps, each one placing his enemy closer to a fall. He knew the slave catcher returned to the nearby tavern every night. He knew the trail through the woods was dark and narrow. He knew that no one cared enough about the man to protect him. Louis also knew that he must move carefully. If he struck too soon, suspicion would fall on him. If he waited too long, the man might leave the colony again. The balance between patience and action became his greatest challenge. As he walked through the quiet night, the words of every cry he once heard from enslaved men and women echoed in his thoughts. This revenge was not only for him. It was for all those who suffered under the cruelty of men like the catcher. His steps became slower as he reached the small house he lived in. He lit a candle, sat on the edge of the bed, and closed his eyes. He would wait one more night, and then the real story of vengeance would begin. The next morning, the colony seemed restless. Rumors of new runaways and distant rebellions spread like whispers through the marketplace. Traders argued, soldiers marched with irritated expressions, and enslaved people moved quickly to avoid punishment. Louis walked through the center of town with measured steps, careful not to draw attention. The officials respected him, but they did not trust him. No one trusted an executioner, whether enslaved or free. The role carried an invisible weight that hung around him like smoke. As he approached the main square, he spotted the slave catcher again. The man spoke with guards, waving his arms as he bragged about his strength. Louis listened quietly, pretending to be arranging tools on a wooden table. The catcher seemed exactly the same as before, reckless, loud, certain that the world would always bend to him. Louis noticed that the man carried a long knife at his belt and a small iron hook used to restrain captured runaways. Louis's eyes studied the hook carefully. Years ago, that same iron hook had been pressed into his shoulder when he collapsed from exhaustion. The scar still remained. Seeing the tool again awakened something deep inside him. Later in the day, the officials announced that Louis would accompany a small patrol on an inspection of forest paths used by runaways. This was perfect. The patrol included 2 soldiers and the slave catcher. Louis felt his heart beat slower, not faster. Revenge required a calm spirit, not a rushing mind. The group moved into the woods during late afternoon, as light filtered through tall cypress trees. The path became narrower and quieter with each step. Birds called from branches, insects hummed in the thick air, and the ground softened beneath their feet. Louis walked behind the slave catcher, watching his movements and listening to the rhythm of his breathing. The 2 soldiers walked ahead, talking about unrelated things. They were not focused. They did not expect danger. They trusted the slave catcher to guide them. Louis kept his expression empty, so no one would see the thoughts building inside him. When the group reached a split in the path, the soldiers argued about which direction to take. The slave catcher insisted on turning left, saying that runaway groups had been spotted in that area. Louis followed quietly. The path to the left was darker, surrounded by thick hanging moss that blocked sunlight. The air was heavy with moisture, and the silence felt almost unnatural. Louis knew these woods well. He knew which paths led deeper into the wilderness, and which paths ended near hidden marshes. As they walked further, the soldiers grew uneasy. One of them complained about the heat. The other asked why no tracks were visible.
The slave catcher mocked them, saying they were too soft to handle real work. Louis watched the soldiers closely. Their nerves created tension that could be used as a cover. If something happened in these woods, the soldiers would believe it was the work of runaways or wild animals. They would never suspect a single man. The group continued forward until they reached a narrow point where the path dipped downward and water pooled in the soil. The soldiers stepped over carefully while the slave catcher pushed through without slowing. Louis paused for a moment, then followed. Ahead of him, the catcher bent to examine a broken branch. Louis saw that the soldiers were several steps ahead and distracted. The catcher was alone in a perfect position. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath. This was the moment he had waited for. But Louis did not strike. Not yet. He was close enough to do it, but not close enough to escape suspicion. He needed something more. Something that would make the death look like an accident or an attack from an unseen force. So he stepped back and allowed the moment to pass. Revenge must not only be satisfying, it must be safe. It must be unseen. And Louis had already waited years. He could wait a little longer. He turned away from the catcher and examined another part of the path. His steps were steady, but inside his mind the storm continued to grow. That night, Louis returned home with thoughts swirling like heavy clouds. The patrol had ended with no incident. The soldiers complained their way back to the colony, while the slave catcher continued bragging. Louis listened carefully to every careless detail the man revealed. He learned that the catcher visited the tavern near the waterfront every night after sundown. He also learned that he drank heavily, often until he could barely walk. Louis understood that drunkenness created opportunity. A man who walked alone in the dark after drinking was a man walking toward danger without even realizing it. Louis spent the evening sitting at his small wooden table, thinking about the woods, thinking about the narrow paths, and thinking about the perfect conditions required for a silent kill. His plan became clearer with each breath he took. He imagined the path lit only by moonlight. He imagined the sound of leaves beneath footsteps. He imagined the moment when the man first realized he was not alone, and he imagined the silence that would follow. Before going to sleep, Louis opened his small window and looked outside. The moon hung low, bright enough to reveal the shadows of buildings and the faint movement of people returning to their quarters. He closed his eyes and listened. Every night carried its own sounds. Tonight, he heard the gentle splash of river water against wooden posts. He heard distant laughter from the tavern, and he heard the soft rustle of leaves as wind drifted through the colony. He imagined the slave catcher sitting in the tavern, shouting at the bartender, mocking the enslaved men and women who passed outside. He imagined the man lifting his drink with the same hand that once lifted a whip. The thought filled him with controlled anger, not blind fury. Blind fury could lead to mistakes. Controlled anger kept the mind sharp. Louis opened his eyes again. He had the plan. All he needed now was the right night. 2 days later, the moment finally arrived. A heavy rain fell in the evening, flooding the streets and pushing people indoors. The tavern, however, remained open because drunk men cared little about mud or rain. Louis watched from a distance as the slave catcher staggered inside during the storm. The sky rumbled with soft thunder. Rain poured down the wooden roofs and splashed onto the ground, turning the streets into shallow pools. Louis stood quietly, under the corner of a storage shed, waiting. The rain created natural cover. It muted sounds, blurred footprints, and cloaked movements. It made everything harder to see. It made everything easier to hide. Louis walked toward the woods, choosing the long path that circled behind the tavern. He moved slowly, stepping through shadows with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The catcher eventually stumbled out of the tavern, drunk and unsteady. He swung his arms as he walked, slipping in the mud. Louis watched from a distance as the man headed toward the forest path. This was perfect. Drunk men always chose shortcuts when returning home. They believed the dark saved time. They believed nothing in the woods would harm them because they harmed others. Louis followed in silence, staying far enough that he could not be seen, but close enough that he could strike when the time came. The rain intensified, creating a curtain of falling water that shimmered in the faint moonlight. The trees ahead formed a dark tunnel. The slave catcher stepped inside without fear. Louis stepped inside behind him, and the forest swallowed them both. The woods were darker than usual because of the storm. Thick branches blocked most of the moonlight, leaving only thin silver lines scattered across the wet ground. The slave catcher stumbled forward, muttering to himself, unaware that anything was wrong. Louis moved quietly, stepping where the mud was thickest so that rain would erase any sign of his presence. The sound of rainfall covered every soft footstep. Louis listened carefully to the rhythm of the catcher's movement. The man slipped, cursed, then continued walking. Louis followed, slipping behind trees, moving like a shadow, with breath controlled and heartbeat steady. Every detail felt precise. Every second felt balanced. The moment to strike was approaching. It would come when the path narrowed between two twisted trees that formed an arch. Beyond that arch, the ground dipped sharply into a small ravine. A fall there would be deadly, especially in the rain. The slave catcher reached the narrow arch and paused to steady himself. He leaned on one of the trees, breathing loudly. Louis remained hidden behind thick brush, watching. He stepped forward softly, but not close enough to reveal himself. He wanted the man's fear to rise in the final moments. Revenge meant more than simply ending a life. It meant letting the man feel something he had never felt before. Vulnerability, panic, the realization that cruelty carries consequences. Louis stepped on a branch intentionally. The sound cracked through the rain. The slave catcher turned sharply, squinting into the darkness. His voice rose in a drunken growl as he asked who was there. Louis did not answer. Silence can be sharper than a weapon. The man took a step backward, slipping slightly. He stared at the darkness with growing confusion. Louis stepped again, this time allowing a faint outline of his shape to appear between the trees. The catcher froze. He sensed a presence, but could not understand it. The rain blurred Louis's face. The shadows hid his identity. Louis moved closer, slowly, letting the man feel each moment stretch. The slave catcher pulled his knife with trembling hands. He waved it wildly, threatening whoever hid in the dark. Louis watched him carefully, studying his weakness. Drunk, off balance, frayed, unsure. Louis stepped sideways into deeper shadow, forcing the slave catcher to turn in the wrong direction. The man shouted again, calling for guards who were far away and deafened by the storm. No one would come to save him. Louis reached the point where the ground sloped downward toward the ravine. He paused, then stepped into view, allowing the moonlight to reveal his face for just 1 second. The slave catcher froze. His eyes widened. Recognition struck him like lightning. He whispered Louis's name with disbelief.
Before he could speak again, Louis stepped forward, grabbed the man's arm, and twisted it sharply. The knife fell into the mud. The catcher stumbled backward, slipping in the wet soil. Louis pushed once, hard and controlled. The slave catcher slid, arms flailing, legs kicking as the ground gave way beneath him. He fell helplessly down the muddy slope toward the ravine. His scream echoed through the woods, but ended suddenly when his body struck hidden rocks below. Louis stood at the top of the slope, breathing quietly as rain washed over him. The forest held its silence once more. The revenge he had waited for so long had finally begun. But Louis knew this was only the first step. Others still lived. Others who carried the same cruelty. Others who believed themselves untouchable. As Louis turned back toward the colony, he understood his life could never return to normal. Each step he took in the mud felt heavier, but also clearer. He was no longer the executioner assigned by the officials. He was becoming something else. Something the colony would fear once they understood. A man who delivered justice in the shadows. The morning after the slave catcher's death, the colony awoke to loud voices, hurried footsteps, and confused whispers that spread through the streets like moving shadows. Guards rushed across muddy paths, officials shouted orders, and enslaved workers watched from a distance with nervous eyes. No one knew what had happened, only that the body of the slave catcher had been found at the bottom of a ravine, broken, silent, and already cold from the night storm. Soldiers argued whether he slipped or whether someone had pushed him, but the heavy rain erased every clue. Louis walked among them with a straight face, carrying out his duties with calm obedience. But deep inside his heart, something pulsed like a second heartbeat. He listened to every conversation, every whisper, and every suspicion. Some guards blamed drunkenness. Others blamed the dangerous forest paths. No one considered the possibility of revenge. The officials called Louis to inspect the body as part of standard procedures for violent death. As he looked down at the twisted remains of the man who once tortured him, he felt no joy and no regret, only a stillness that made him feel more alive than he had felt in years. While soldiers argued, Louis studied the ravine and the broken branches above it, pretending to make observations. He already knew the truth. The forest had not taken the man. Justice had taken him. But the danger was far from over. Louis understood that one kill never ends a history built on cruelty. Revenge grows like roots beneath the soil. As long as the pain of enslaved people continued, the need for vengeance would continue as well. The officials soon dismissed the death as an accident, believing the rain and darkness were enough explanation. They returned to their routines with careless ease, never imagining a quiet force had begun to move among them. Louis walked back to his quarters with slow, thoughtful steps, knowing the colony had entered a new stage, and that every choice he made from this moment forward would matter far more than the last. 2 days passed, and the colony regained its usual rhythm, but Louis could sense a new heaviness in the air. Even the enslaved people moved differently, whispering about the slave catcher's death with cautious hope. Rumors grew that spirits in the forest had punished him for his cruelty. Others believed runaway fighters hiding deep in the wilderness had taken revenge. Louis remained silent, allowing every rumor to grow freely, because rumors were shields. They distracted people from the truth. One evening, Louis overheard 2 guards discussing the next inspection of plantations along the river. They mentioned that the overseer of the Bayou Sauvage plantation had been beating enslaved workers more violently than usual. The name of the overseer tightened something inside Louis. He was another man who had once whipped Louis until he bled on the ground. He was the second on Louis's list. The thought of facing him again filled Louis with a slow, determined fire. Unlike the slave catcher, this overseer lived in a wide open area surrounded by workers and guards. Killing him quietly would be difficult. Louis spent the night thinking about how to approach such a dangerous task. His mind created scenarios, examined risks, and erased reckless ideas. He began to realize that revenge required more than anger. It required patience, precision, and deep understanding of both enemies and surroundings. When he finally lay down on his bed, sleep refused to come. He stared at the ceiling, listening to distant voices outside, wondering how many more acts of cruelty happened every night while he planned in silence. His thoughts drifted to the overseer's face, the way the man once stepped on his back while whipping him. Louis felt the memory pressing against his chest like a heavy stone. He would not rush. He would not fail. He would take revenge again, but only when the time and place made the man vulnerable. And Louis knew that every cruel person eventually creates his own moment of weakness without realizing it. The following morning, Louis joined the officials for the inspection trip. They traveled by boat down the slow, winding river that cut through the wetlands. The water reflected tall cypress trees and hanging moss that swayed gently in the breeze. The officials spoke about plantation work, profits, and new laws, as if human suffering were not part of their conversations. Louis sat quietly behind them, watching the water, but every sound around him sharpened his senses. A large metal cage stood at the back of the boat, used for transporting enslaved workers accused of resisting orders. The sight of it made Louis feel a cold focus settle over him. When the boat arrived at Bayou Sauvage, the overseer greeted the officials with fake politeness. Louis stood behind them, observing. The overseer's eyes were small and sharp, like a predator's. His voice carried arrogance with every word. He proudly explained how he punished enslaved workers to keep discipline, how he increased their workload, and how he used fear to control them. Louis listened to every sentence with growing calmness. Not anger, but calmness, because anger could be dangerous. He followed the group as they walked through the fields. He saw workers with fresh wounds on their backs. He saw women laboring with trembling hands. He saw children carrying loads far heavier than their small bodies could handle. The overseer shouted at them, mocking their pain. Louis memorized each detail. The officials finished their inspection, praised the overseer, and prepared to return. Louis knew he could not act during the day. Too many eyes watched. Too many questions would rise. But he noticed something important. The overseer had a habit of walking alone to the edge of the swamp at night to smoke and drink. Louis filed that detail into his mind. The swamp at night was silent enough to hide footsteps, dark enough to hide faces, and dangerous enough to swallow a body without leaving a trace. Louis left the plantation with a slow, deep breath. His plan had begun without a single word spoken.
That night, Louis returned on foot, hidden by darkness and guided only by his memory of the plantation paths. He moved carefully, stepping on soft ground so he would not alert anyone. The moon was thin and low, casting faint light through branches that swayed like silent watchers. Louis reached the edge of the field and waited behind a large tree, listening to every sound. Crickets sang in the grass. Frogs croaked near pools of water. Wind rustled through the tall reeds. Minutes turned into a slow, quiet stretch of time. Then he heard footsteps. The overseer appeared, walking with his pipe glowing faintly in his hand. He muttered to himself as he drank from a small bottle. Louis waited until the man walked past him, then stepped from the shadows. The overseer heard the faint movement and turned sharply, frowning into the darkness. He called out angrily, demanding that whoever was hiding reveal themselves. Louis said nothing. Silence once again became his weapon. The overseer took a step forward, raising his lantern, but the swamp wind blew it dim, making the night even darker. He lifted the bottle to his lips again, unaware of how close danger had come. Louis took one slow step, then another, letting the sound blend with the breeze. The overseer turned, confused, sensing a presence but unable to see it clearly. Louis stopped only a few feet behind him. The swamp held its breath. His hand tightened slowly. The overseer whispered a curse. Lightning flickered in the distant sky, and for a brief moment Louis's face appeared in the dim glow. Recognition struck the overseer just as it struck the slave catcher days earlier. His breath caught in his throat. He stepped back in shock, his heels sinking into soft mud. Louis moved forward with controlled speed and pushed the man toward the swamp. The overseer tried to shout, but the thick mud pulled him down with a sudden sucking force. Louis stepped back, letting the swamp take him. The man struggled, flailed, and gasped as mud filled his throat. His lantern fell and extinguished. Darkness swallowed everything. As the last bubble of air rose from the mud, the swamp became still again. Louis stood quietly, listening to the silence he had created. Another piece of injustice had been erased, but Louis knew the night was not finished. Revenge opens doors that cannot be closed. And now, the path ahead was darker than ever. The morning after the overseer vanished into the swamp, the colony grew tense in a way Louis had never seen before. Soldiers marched in groups, plantation owners gathered in worried clusters, and whispers moved through the air like drifting smoke. The overseer's absence was discovered when he failed to appear for his morning inspection. Workers claimed they last saw him walking toward the swamp the previous night, but none dared to say more. The officials arrived quickly, their horses splashing through wet soil as they questioned everyone present. Louis stood among them, silent, watching the unfolding fear. The swamp was searched, but heavy mud erased every trace of the struggle. Only the overseer's broken lantern was found half sunk in the water, its glass cracked and its metal frame twisted, as if something pulled it beneath the surface. The officials argued over whether he drowned, wandered off drunk, or was attacked by a wild creature. No one considered the possibility that a man they trusted had been hunted in the very darkness he used to terrify others. Louis sensed that the colony was beginning to feel something it had long ignored, the awareness that cruelty does not grant safety. Many overseers became cautious, lowering their voices, striking fewer blows and watching the shadows more closely at night. Louis maintained calmness, but a deeper part of him sensed danger rising. For every act of revenge he carried out, the colony's fear grew, and the more fear grew, the more desperate people became. Louis knew desperate men made reckless decisions. He needed to move carefully, not only for himself, but for the enslaved community who silently prayed for more justice. As he walked through the plantation paths that day, he noticed eyes following him, not with suspicion, but with quiet hope, as if he had become an unseen protector. The thought weighed heavily on him. He had never asked to be a symbol. He only wanted justice. But justice, once awakened, spreads like fire. As tensions spread across the colony, Louis began to observe the behavior of the officials and overseers more closely. He noticed one overseer in particular who seemed unusually agitated. This man, known for cruelty beyond reason, had once ordered the whipping of an elderly woman simply because she dropped a basket. Louis remembered him well. He was a tall, harsh man, with a loud voice and a deep scar across his cheek. A scar rumored to have come from a rebellion many years earlier. Louis had never forgotten the day this man kicked a sick boy in the ribs because the boy could not stand fast enough. The boy died 2 days later. Louis had buried that memory with many others, but now, as the overseer paced nervously around the colony, shouting orders at anyone near him, the memory resurfaced like a rising tide. Louis watched him from a distance, noticing how often he glanced toward the forest, as if expecting something to emerge from it. The overseer's fear grew quickly, and fear made him unpredictable. 2 days after the disappearance of the overseer from Bayou Sauvage, this new target began carrying a pistol everywhere he went. He questioned enslaved workers harshly, accused them of plotting against him, and threatened them with the punishments he never followed through on because his hands shook too much. Louis understood that fear weakens even the strongest tyrants. It makes them clumsy, desperate, and unable to see danger approaching until it is too late. He needed to wait for the moment when fear would make the man careless. That moment arrived on a rainy afternoon when the overseer, angry and restless, left the plantation house alone and walked toward the storage barn behind the fields. Louis watched him from the shadows and followed at a distance. He moved silently between rows of tall grass, studying every step the man took. Lightning cracked in the sky, striking just far enough to create sudden flashes of white light. Each flash revealed the overseer's trembling hands and the frantic way he looked over his shoulder. Louis stayed hidden, letting the man's fear guide him deeper into the trap he did not know was forming around him. The overseer entered the storage barn and slammed the door behind him. Louis waited outside, listening. The wind howled across the field, shaking the barn walls. Rain beat hard against the roof, masking the sound of footsteps. Louis pushed the door open slowly and slipped inside. The barn was dark except for a faint glow from a small lantern the overseer placed on a wooden shelf. Tools hung from beams. Ropes lay coiled in corners, and heavy sacks filled the air with the smell of grain. The overseer stood near the back wall, gripping his pistol and muttering curses under his breath. Louis stepped onto the wooden floor, allowing the board to creak softly. The overseer spun around, lifting the pistol and pointing it blindly into the dark. He shouted demands, but Louis remained quiet. Another board creaked as Louis shifted to the side. The overseer fired a shot toward the sound, but the bullet struck a wooden beam. Sparks flew briefly, then darkness returned. The overseer's breathing quickened as he tried to reload, but his hands shook too violently. Louis stepped closer, his shadow barely visible in the faint lantern light. The overseer shouted that he knew someone was there. He warned that he would shoot again. Louis said nothing. Silence once more became the weight pressing into the man's mind. The overseer stepped back, tripping over a sack and falling onto the floor. The pistol slipped from his hand and skidded across the barn. Louis moved forward, stepping on the pistol with his foot. The overseer froze as Louis finally stepped into the weak lantern glow, revealing his face. Recognition flooded the overseer's eyes with horror. He whispered Louis's name with shaking lips as memories of past cruelty flashed through his mind. Louis did not speak. He reached for a rope hanging from a beam, pulled it down, and looped it into a simple knot. The overseer crawled backward, begging, promising to change, promising anything that might save him. But Louis's silence spoke louder than words. He took the rope, stepped forward, and wrapped it around a beam above. The overseer screamed, but the storm outside swallowed his cries. Louis carried out the act swiftly, not with pleasure, but with the calmness of justice long overdue. When the barn became silent once more, he lowered the lantern flame until the room fell into complete darkness. Then he left quietly, closing the door behind him as the storm washed away everything. The next morning brought chaos back into the colony. 2 overseers had died within days, one swallowed by swamp, and one found hanging in a locked barn. Fear gripped every plantation. Guards patrolled more frequently, plantation owners stayed indoors, and harsh punishments suddenly stopped, as if cruelty itself had grown afraid to show its face. Rumors spread faster than horses could run. Some said ghosts had risen. Some said runaway warriors were striking back. Others whispered that the executioner had become an avenger in the night. Louis walked through the colony with steady steps, knowing that suspicion was growing. Not enough to accuse him, but enough for people to watch him more closely. He felt eyes on him from windows, from behind fences, and from corners of buildings. His steady calmness became both his shield and his danger. He knew he had crossed a threshold he could never return from. Revenge had begun as justice for the pain he suffered, but now it had become justice for all who suffered silently every day. The enslaved community sensed that something powerful was happening. They spoke to Louis with more respect, more caution, and even more hope. But Louis also sensed a new threat rising. Officials would not remain blind forever. The colony would soon search for someone to blame, and the executioner stood in a position that made him both trusted and mistrusted at the same time. As Louis prepared for whatever came next, he understood that he was no longer simply reacting to cruelty. He had become a force shaped by the suffering of an entire people. And once a force is awakened, it cannot easily be stopped. The colony soon became a place where silence felt heavier than sound. Every person seemed to sense that something unseen was moving through their world, something that punished cruelty with a terrifying precision. Plantation owners gathered in secret meetings, arguing about how to restore order. Soldiers were ordered to sleep with weapons at their sides. Overseers who once walked boldly through fields now avoided the woods entirely. Even the harsh midday sun could not erase the fear that clung to every corner of the colony. Louis observed all of this with careful eyes. He noticed how overseers no longer lifted their whips as quickly. He noticed how enslaved people whispered at night with new courage. He noticed how officials tried to hide their unease behind strict commands. But Louis also knew fear creates suspicion, and suspicion always looks for a target. One afternoon he entered the council building to receive instructions for the next week. As he waited silently in the corner, he overheard 2 officials speaking in low tones. They wondered whether the executioner might know more about the recent deaths than he was saying. One claimed Louis was too calm during the investigations. The other insisted he was loyal because he had never disobeyed an order. Louis kept his face still, even as he felt their words sink into his mind. They were beginning to watch him, not openly, but quietly. And quiet watchers were the most dangerous of all. Louis stepped away when summoned, bowed respectfully, and left the building without showing a single trace of concern. But once outside, he felt the heavy truth settling into his thoughts. His acts of justice had changed the colony more quickly than he expected. Now, he needed to be more careful than ever, because one mistake could turn him from silent avenger into hunted prey. The past few weeks had proven one thing clearly. Revenge is not a path walked easily. It is a flame that must be controlled with steady hands, or it will burn the one who holds it. That night, while most people hid behind locked doors, Louis walked quietly toward the quarters where enslaved men gathered after long work hours. He never spoke much to them, but they always greeted him with respectful nods. This time, however, something different happened. A young man stepped forward, his eyes filled with determination. He told Louis about a woman who had been whipped nearly to death by her mistress 3 days earlier. He said the woman survived only because another enslaved woman shielded her with her own body. Louis listened without interrupting. The young man explained that the mistress responsible was known for violent cruelty. She beat workers for the smallest mistakes, threw hot water on anyone she disliked, and once ordered the punishment of a boy simply because he sang while working. Louis felt a slow coldness fill his chest as he heard these details. The young man lowered his voice and said something else. The mistress had recently spread rumors, claiming she believed spirits were killing overseers because the enslaved were bringing curses into the colony. She wanted harsher rules. She demanded new punishments. Louis thanked the young man quietly and walked away. He needed no further explanation. Cruelty belonged to no specific gender. Evil could live in any heart that enjoyed the suffering of others. If he truly fought for justice, then those who inflicted pain, whether man or woman, must face the consequences. But this situation was different. Plantation mistresses rarely walked alone. They remained inside guarded houses, protected by husbands, relatives, and house staff. Killing her openly would bring suspicion immediately. Louis needed a new method, one that would strike quietly and leave no trace. He spent the rest of the night planning, thinking through every possibility. He walked past the plantation where she lived and studied the layout from a distance. The house was large, with wide porches and bright windows that faced the fields like watchful eyes. Dogs patrolled the yard. Guards slept near the entrance. But every structure, no matter how guarded, has a weakness. Louis knew he would find it. 3 days later, he began to observe the mistress from afar. She walked through the yard each morning, shouting orders at the house servants. She slapped a girl for dragging her feet and scolded another woman for crying from exhaustion. Louis watched from behind a row of trees, noting every habit, every pattern. The mistress often went to the smokehouse behind the plantation kitchen to check supplies. She walked there alone because she believed no enslaved person would dare attack her. She carried keys at her waist, and the sound of their jingling followed her wherever she went. Louis noticed something important. She often lingered in the smokehouse, longer than necessary, tasting food and complaining loudly about the flavor. The smokehouse had only one door. Its roof was low, its walls thick, and its interior dark. It was the perfect place for a quiet death, but Louis could not simply walk in while she was there. Too many servants came and went. He needed a moment when she would step inside alone at night, without company. That moment came sooner than expected. One evening, the mistress became angry because her husband requested salted meat for a late meal, and she believed the servants were too slow. Furious, she announced that she would fetch it herself. She grabbed a lantern and marched toward the smokehouse. Servants avoided her path, bowing their heads so she would not strike them. Louis stood hidden near the edge of the yard, waiting like a shadow, blending with other shadows. The mistress entered the smokehouse, leaving the door slightly open because the lantern smoke made the air hot and thick. Louis moved closer. Every sound around him grew louder. The wind rustled leaves. The dogs growled lightly. The lantern flame flickered inside the smokehouse. Louis waited until he heard the mistress muttering to herself. Then he stepped silently to the door and pushed it shut. The latch fell into place with a small metallic click. The mistress turned quickly and called out angrily. Louis said nothing. He reached for a long wooden beam left near the wall and slid it through the door handles from the outside, locking her inside completely. The mistress shouted, but her voice softened behind the thick walls. Louis picked up a stone and hammered the wooden beam until it wedged firmly, sealing the door. Then he lifted the lantern she had placed outside and tipped it onto the dry grass beside the smokehouse. The flame spread slowly, then quickly, climbing the wooden wall. Smoke rose into the night air. Dogs barked in confusion. Servants cried out as they saw the fire, but no one dared run into the flames. Louis watched from a distance, his face calm, his heart steady. The mistress screamed inside. The fire grew brighter. Within minutes, the entire building was burning. Servants screamed for water, but the flames rose too fast. The mistress's voice slowly disappeared in the crackling fire. When the roof collapsed inward, silence replaced her screams. Louis turned and walked away into the darkness. The next morning, chaos returned even louder than before. The fire had been discovered at dawn, and the charred remains of the mistress were carried out of the ruins. Her husband shouted at soldiers, demanding justice, demanding investigations, demanding someone to blame. Servants were questioned aggressively. They cried, insisting they had nothing to do with the fire. Soldiers searched the yard, looking for footprints, broken beams, anything unusual. But heavy rain fell during the night after the fire, washing away every trace. Officials called Louis to examine the remains, believing the executioner would know whether the fire was an accident or deliberate. Louis looked at the ashes without a word. One official whispered that perhaps the mistress fainted inside and dropped her lantern. Another said perhaps God punished her. A third said perhaps rebellious workers set the fire. None of them even considered that someone so quiet and calm stood among them, with the truth buried deep in his heart. As Louis left the yard, he felt a shift in the colony's energy. Fear was no longer limited to overseers and slave hunters. Now, even plantation families felt the weight of a hidden justice they could not understand. The enslaved community, however, sensed something different. They whispered quietly about the flames, about the sudden justice, about the mysterious change in the colony. Some believed an unseen spirit protected them. Others believed a warrior had risen among them. Louis heard these whispers during the night when he walked through the quarters. No one suspected him directly, but some looked at him with new eyes, eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude, reverence, and silent respect. Louis knew the path ahead would only grow more dangerous. The officials would soon realize these deaths were not random. Suspicion would grow. Eyes would watch corners. Footsteps would follow him. But he also knew something deeper. His mission was not finished. Too many cruel hands remained unpunished. Too many innocent people suffered each day. Louis took a deep breath and stepped into the night, accepting that he had become something more than an executioner. He had become the silent justice that the colony feared and the enslaved prayed for. The colony entered a strange season of fear when the mistress's death followed the earlier revenge killings. People whispered that something invisible moved through the land, choosing the cruel and swallowing them one by one. Even the wind seemed to carry uneasiness. Dogs barked at empty spaces. Lanterns flickered without reason. Overseers who once walked like kings now kept close to one another, refusing to patrol the fields alone. Some slept with pistols clutched to their chests. Others drank until sunrise just to quiet their nerves. The officials tried to regain control, but their voices shook when they spoke. They called meetings, issued warnings, and demanded more discipline. But their orders came from fear, not authority. Louis watched these changes with quiet attention. The colony was unraveling, thread by thread, under the weight of its own cruelty. Enslaved people saw the changes too. When they walked past overseers, they noticed the tremor in their hands. When they carried out chores, they noticed the nervous glances of plantation owners. For the first time, those who tortured them looked weaker than those they oppressed. Louis felt a shift in the balance of power, a shift he never expected to see in his lifetime. Yet he also sensed danger, building like a rising storm. Suspicion no longer floated lazily through the air. It was now gathering into something sharper, something that could cut. A new rumor spread among officials, a rumor that someone inside the colony was orchestrating the killings. They were certain it was not runaway warriors. The methods were too precise, too silent, too close to the heart of the colony. They believed it was someone trusted, someone familiar, someone who moved freely. Louis listened to these whispers from the shadows and understood with chilling clarity that his name was forming silently on the edge of their thoughts. Not spoken yet, but rising like a tide. He needed to stay ahead of them. He needed one more act of justice that would shift suspicion away from him and direct their fear elsewhere. A final strike that would shake the colony so deeply that officials would look toward the wilderness, not toward their own council halls. Louis did not want to rush, but he knew the time for careful steps was narrowing. When he returned to his quarters that night, he saw two shadows move near his door before they slipped away. He stood still, listening. The air felt heavier than before. Officials had begun watching him. The next morning brought news that made Louis pause. A cruel plantation owner, known for beating enslaved men until they collapsed, had ordered heavy punishments after hearing rumors of uprisings. He was a rich man, powerful and loud, with influence that reached deep into the colony's administration. He was feared by enslaved workers because he punished entire groups for the smallest mistakes. He once forced a man to stand in the sun for an entire day while his back bled from fresh wounds. Louis had witnessed his cruelty years earlier. Now, the owner's rage made him even more dangerous. He blamed runaways for recent deaths. He declared that any enslaved person caught whispering, hiding, or showing signs of resistance would be whipped without mercy. Guards followed his orders eagerly, relieved to have direction after days of confusion. Louis knew that allowing such a man to continue breathing meant more innocent lives would suffer. But the difficulty lay in the man's household. He was always surrounded by guards, relatives, business partners, and armed overseers. Killing him inside his home would bring too much suspicion. Killing him in public would be impossible. But Louis realized something. Powerful men often hide their deepest fears behind their loudest voices, and this man held a secret fear. He refused to let anyone else touch his horses. He believed only he knew how to feed and calm them. Every evening, before sunset, he walked to the stables alone. The stable yard was large, filled with hay, wooden beams, and iron tools. But there was a small back entrance, rarely used except by stable hands. Louis knew that if he could reach the stables at the right moment, away from guards, away from watchful eyes, the man would be vulnerable. But everything had to be perfect. One mistake would destroy everything. So Louis spent 2 days observing the stable yard. He watched how the shadows fell at dusk. He noted when guards changed shifts. He listened to the horses breathe. Every detail formed a picture in his mind, a map that marked the perfect moment to strike. On the 3rd evening, when the sky grew dim and the wind carried the scent of approaching rain, Louis sensed the moment had arrived. Louis moved through the colony, like a shadow merging with the air. He wore a plain coat to hide the executioner's tools that hung at his waist. Tools that gave him permission to walk anywhere, without question. He approached the stable yard from the side, keeping to the darkest areas where lantern light did not reach. The plantation owner stepped inside the stables, holding a lantern and muttering to himself about lazy workers. Louis listened to his footsteps. They echoed against wooden walls. The horses snorted nervously, sensing the rising tension. Louis circled to the back entrance he had studied for days. It creaked softly when opened, but the rain beginning to fall masked the sound. Inside the stable, the owner bent over to check a horse's hooves. His lantern flickered, throwing long shadows across the floor. Louis stepped closer, blending his footsteps with the sound of horse hooves shifting. The man heard something and straightened. He looked around, calling out with irritation. Louis stayed still. Silence again became his shield. The man returned to his task. Louis moved behind him with slow, careful steps. A thick wooden beam supported the roof, only a few feet away. Hanging from it was a metal hook used to hold saddles and heavy bags. Louis reached for a rope coiled on the floor and felt its rough texture against his hands. He looped one end silently and threw it over the beam. The owner sensed movement only when Louis stepped behind him. He turned sharply, but before he could shout, Louis wrapped the rope around his throat and pulled. The lantern fell and rolled across the floor. The horses kicked and neighed in panic. The owner clawed at the rope, his face turning red, his legs kicking wildly. Louis tightened his grip, pulling with the steady strength of a man delivering overdue judgment. The man's feet dragged across hay and soil until finally they stilled. Louis lowered the body slowly to the ground, letting the rope fall away. He picked up the lantern and carefully extinguished it. Then he dragged the man beneath the horse rack, where tools cast long shadows over him, making the body nearly invisible, unless someone looked closely. Louis left through the back entrance, slipping into the night as rain washed away his footprints. The storm grew heavier, concealing everything. By morning, the body would be discovered, but not the man who delivered justice. The stable yard erupted with screams at sunrise when workers found the plantation owner's lifeless body. Soldiers rushed in, Relatives shouted accusations. The council held an emergency meeting. Their fear exploded into a frenzy of suspicion. They no longer believed accidents were killing cruel overseers. They no longer believed spirits or runaways were responsible. Now they believed someone inside the colony was hunting them. They demanded answers. They interrogated enslaved people, searched their quarters, and punished those who cried too loudly. But Louis noticed something deeper. The officials' eyes had changed. They were beginning to look at him differently. Not openly, but with small glances that held questions. During the investigation of the stable yard, an official asked Louis whether he had noticed anyone suspicious. His voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp. Another asked whether Louis had walked near the stables the previous night. Louis answered with respect, keeping his voice soft and steady. He said he had been in his quarters. They nodded, but their eyes did not soften. Louis realized the truth. The final stage of his mission had begun. He had become the very thing the colony feared most. And fear creates watchers. Watchers create danger. If he wanted to remain free long enough to finish what he started, he needed to step deeper into silence, deeper into shadows, and deeper into the hidden path that revenge had carved for him. The colony was tightening its grip around itself, unsure whether the executioner remained loyal or whether he had become the silent force changing everything. Louis walked away from the stable investigation slowly, feeling the weight of every eye upon him. The world around him grew sharper, louder, more dangerous. But inside his heart, he felt something unshakable. He was not finished. Not yet. The story of justice had one more edge that needed to be sharpened, and he knew the next strike would be the one that echoed across the entire colony forever. The colony trembled beneath the weight of its own fear, as the days following the plantation owner's death stretched into a tense silence that felt like a rope pulled tight around every throat. No one walked alone anymore. Lanterns were kept burning even during late hours. Soldiers patrolled with trembling hands, gripping rifles as if shadows themselves could attack. Overseers refused to work without company, and plantation owners demanded extra guards at their doors. The entire colony felt cursed, yet the people never realized that the real curse had always been their own cruelty. Louis walked among them with quiet steps, watching their fear grow, the way smoke rises from a smoldering fire. Each face he passed carried suspicion. Each whisper behind him carried his name, without speaking it. He knew the officials were growing desperate. Their meetings became longer, their voices sharper. He noticed how often their eyes followed him now, not openly accusing, but silently circling him, like wolves unsure of when to attack. He felt the pressure tightening around him, but he did not panic. Panic is born from fear, and fear clouds judgment. Louis's mind remained steady, sharpened by every injustice he had witnessed. He understood that the colony was reaching the edge of something inevitable. Either they would find someone to blame soon, or they would drown in their own chaos. For Louis, this meant the final stage of his path had arrived. He could not allow suspicion to trap him. He needed to strike one last time, a strike so powerful, so precise, so unexpected, that it would redirect the colony's attention away from him and towards something else entirely. As he sat in his quarters that night, the candle flame flickered, as if it sensed the storm building inside his thoughts. Louis breathed slowly, letting memories of every injustice, every lash, every scream guide him. His revenge began with pain, but now it was woven into something larger. It had become a symbol, and this final act needed to echo loudly enough to protect the symbol even after he disappeared from sight. The target for his final act was not an overseer, not a guard, and not a plantation mistress. It was someone higher, someone whose cruelty shaped the laws that permitted suffering without consequence. The governor's chief magistrate, a powerful man who signed every order for punishment and approved every violent decision. He walked with pride, believing himself untouchable because he controlled the colony's justice. But Louis knew that justice built on cruelty eventually collapses under its own weight. The magistrate lived in a large residence near the river, guarded by soldiers day and night. His arrogance made him careless. He believed that since his laws protected him, no one would dare approach him with danger. Louis spent 3 days studying the magistrate's routines. The man often sat alone in his private study, late at night, reviewing documents by candlelight. The windows of the study opened toward the river, and a small balcony extended over the water. Guards patrolled the front, but the riverbank at night was mostly silent. Louis walked along the river several times, letting the sound of water guide his thoughts. He studied the shadows creating natural cover. He studied the guards' movements and the distance between their steps. On the 4th night, Louis finalized his plan. He would approach the magistrate's residence from the river, moving beneath the balcony where shadows hid everything. The plan demanded precision, silence, and absolute calm. But Louis had grown into those qualities, like a warrior shaped by years of fire. As evening settled over the colony, Louis gathered only what he needed, nothing more. He slipped from his quarters into the night, blending with darkness as he walked toward the river. The moon hid behind clouds, and the air felt heavy with the promise of change. When he reached the water's edge, he stepped into the cold river slowly, making almost no sound. He moved along the bank, letting reeds brush against him as he followed the path he had memorized. The magistrate's balcony soon appeared above him, its lantern glowing faintly. Louis paused, listening. The guards were at the front, far enough away that they would not hear anything unless it echoed loudly. Louis took a slow breath and climbed the stones beneath the balcony, careful not to disturb even a pebble out of place. When he reached the underside of the wooden floor, he moved with the quiet patience he had mastered through years of survival. The magistrate sat alone inside the study, the soft scrape of paper against his quill the only sound in the room. Louis could see his silhouette through the thin balcony curtains. The man leaned back in his chair, sipping wine as he reviewed documents that controlled the lives of thousands. Louis stepped onto the balcony, his foot landing lightly, like a shadow touching wood. The magistrate did not hear. Louis opened the balcony door slowly, letting it slide without a sound. The magistrate sensed movement and turned. His eyes widened when he saw Louis standing there, but he did not yet understand. He opened his mouth to shout, but Louis crossed the room with swift silence and placed his hand over the man's mouth. The magistrate's eyes bulged with terror, the same terror he had caused so many others who begged him for mercy. Louis spoke only 3 words, soft and calm. He said that justice had come. The magistrate struggled, knocking over papers and spilling ink across the table, but Louis lifted him and pushed him toward the balcony. The man tried to cling to the railing, but Louis pried his hands away with controlled strength. The river beneath them was dark and deep. Louis whispered that the river remembers everything, even the blood it never saw. Then he pushed the magistrate over the edge. The man fell into the river, with a splash that faded almost instantly beneath the night wind. His body disappeared beneath the water before any guard even noticed. Louis closed the balcony door behind him, wiped the railing to remove any trace, and stepped back onto the riverbank. He walked through the reeds, letting the river wash away the last echoes of the magistrate's life. By the time he reached the path leading into the colony, he felt a stillness settle inside him. A stillness earned through danger, justice, and unbreakable resolve. By sunrise, the colony had erupted into a storm of panic and disbelief. The magistrate's body washed onto the riverbank, discovered by fishermen who ran screaming to the guards. Officials gathered quickly, shouting orders, demanding explanations, and accusing each other of allowing danger to rise so close to their leader. Soldiers searched the river, the forest, the roads, even the slave quarters. They believed runaways had formed an organized rebellion. They feared the marsh warriors, the silent hunters, the unseen fighters of the shadows. They did not look at Louis, not because they trusted him, but because their fear finally convinced them that the enemy came from beyond their walls, not within them. Louis stood among the crowd during the investigation, his expression calm, his body still. He listened to every word spoken. Officials blamed rebels hiding in the swamps. Plantation owners demanded more guards. Soldiers tightened their patrols. The colony became a place of frantic movement, yet its center remained hollow with fear. When the investigation ended that day, the council declared that the magistrate's death was proof that the wilderness held dangerous forces waiting to strike again. They ordered every plantation to increase security,